Hello everyone, today we talk about Yuan-China military organization, tactics, training, and battles. Of course, in a sort of summarized way, as a general introduction to Mongol Chinese warfare. We already observed a lot about Mongol warfare in general. This is, however, specifically about the Yuan. So it's the heavily Sinicized Mongol warfare throughout at least the different stages of, say, Yuan dominance from the conquest to also the following century. The other day I made already a video about the general strategy, campaigns and conquests of the Chingizids in and from China. So we know even eventually, essentially, what occurred of greater military relevance. But it's, of course, important to observe more closely the military machine that did this and sort of refined over time. So starting from the military organization, the original Mongol army, right, is pretty well known to us. Already made again some videos about this. We talked about it from really different points of view. Now there is a first Chinese connection and influence more than else. Temujin's youthful experience in the Khitan armies was concerned. As you know, the young Mongol ruler fought for this people that had controlled part of northern China and had, in fact, already been heavily influenced by its warfare. This involved, for example, advanced poliorcetics, also a substantial use of infantry. It's not that the Mongols wouldn't make, also in the heart of the steppes, use of infantry ever, right? But of course, there was all a specific, in fact, organization and military culture connected with dealing with China, the more civilized, developed, urbanized, sanitary, fortified areas. One aspect that in which the Khitans were more advanced than the sort of more primitive Mongols of the native hinterland was a greater armoredness. This is particularly evident in cavalry. The Mongols, of course, had themselves heavy cavalry with substantial level of armor, but the Khitans were sort of more affluent, and therefore this material wealth also coupled, as we've seen, with one of, for example, the foot or the infantry was all one with, in fact, a more intense sort of impacting type of warfare. It's believed that the original Mongol army may have been fielded at some points counting exclusively on cavalry, right? Infantrymen would have existed as we just observed, but they would have sort of remained available mostly in the native hinterland for defensive reasons. The same Mongol horsemen could and would dismount. We know that as far as Syria against the Mamluks, the Mongols dismounted against heavy missile fire, shielding themselves with their beloved horses, by the way, which tells you how critical such type of missile engagements could be. And so if this happened against the Mamluks, that admittedly had good horse archery, but why this couldn't happen in the native land of such, in fact, originally steppes mounted archery, right? So this would have occurred. We don't have to think again of a purely cavalry fighting army, right? A moving army, yes, to an extent, but even about that, don't think that in spite of the great resistance of the Mongol horse and properly the selection of this breed that could even cross the Himalaya, or pulling off this astonishing logistical feats in hellish environments, like you wouldn't need things like wagons, for example. And in that sense, the speed of an army will not really change that much if it's all cavalry as opposed to also infantry. It's just that the Mongols in many ways were so well oiled as a military machine, we'll observe it now, that especially their general aptness, their general reaction, like to the necessity of moving fast, like across thousands of kilometers to different continents, was for them normal, right? It was something that, I don't know, like a European army would have never had the political, strategical, or logistical needs to do, right? To even decide to put together, because their bases of power were settled in ways that for which this would have been nonsense to do in the first place. That's instead what the Mongols did all the time. So there wasn't any specifically, I don't know, technological or equestrian, let's say, a reason why these armies were so performing. Everything was, if anything, perfected, right, to aim at the maximum efficiency at that level, but it was just a need stemming from the intrinsical lifestyle of these peoples, and so the need also why they made war so relentlessly. Speaking more specifically of organics, we know in Yuan China of the arban, consisting of 10 men. This is basically a shared tent, right? Then 10 arbans, so 100 men, constituted a don or yagun, which would have been some sort of company. 10 yagun formed a mingan, and 10 mingan a tumen, 10 tumen a tuk, right? And here we get in the sort of more, like this is essentially the Mongol decimal system brought from the steppes, but that in fact remains also in China as far as the essentially the, we could say, the regular army. We will talk more about this. That was Mongol in nature was concerned, right? And an army could consist of 2 or more tumen. As we know, we will talk more in depth about Mongol army's organization in some other video, but the essentials are these. I made a video about the actual strength of Mongol armies, which is sort of helpful because it tells you, of course, that the Mongols weren't simply these enormous hordes of warriors. Like, if anything, they moved with the entire herds, with, say, counting in the hundreds of thousands, even for the major regional engagements. But of course, in a broader, and that there were all, again, some, of course, zootechnical, logistical implications in this, but the fighting forces could be more modest. In any case, and this can be, for example, showed by the type of basic foundation of Mongol manpower, right? That is not much like sort of military in organization, rather political and, say, strategical at the intercontinental level, right? It's been estimated that at the peak of Mongol power under Genghis Khan's reign, there were 62,000 men in the left wing, 38,000 in the right, and this, this was the subdivision properly of the entire Mongolia, right? So here we're not talking necessarily about again a whole army that would have been constituted like this. The wings refer to this sort of geographical position of the tribes that were in fact surely co-opted by Genghis Khan and sent here and there, like across the globe, to perform their bloody duties, right? But there would have not been a reason for this also, just to concentrate all these forces somewhere, because logistically it would have been too straining, and there were always multiple peoples to keep at bay. And if we look at China, just the fact that one of these wings was there, ready to move, like would have sort of had a deterrent impact in the country. We know that each of the Mongol princes, in this case Yuki, Chagatai, Ogodai, and Tuli, had a bodyguard of 1,000 men, which of course means not just like 1,000 men, thickly packed, around one guy. It means that this is basically like agile, force that, as you understand, is not quite an army as a whole. Like normal armies would have been around 30,000 fighting men at say in a regional at a regional scale, but these forces were enough. Also considering that they were elite at large, but also tactically complete, right, and independent, autonomous, to defend, generally speaking, the existence properly of the single princes. And they were integrated into larger armies, depending on the situation. The Khan, the great Khan himself, had a bodyguard known as the Keshik that counted 9,000 men. This is recorded in 1203. And we have a breakdown of this force. 1,000 daily guards, let's say guards for daylight, right? So these were the people who had to remain in service all the day long, as far as controlling the great Khan's camp was concerned. 1,000 for the night watch. Then there would be 1,000 archers and apparently 6,000 armored cavalry. This considered was much more like an army proper. It was, as you understand here, fundamentally elite. You have the impression this was probably the ultra-loaded, ultra-heavy, ultra-brutally veteran elite force of the entire Oceanic Empire that Genghis Khan had established. And you can imagine the magnificence, the wealth. We will say at some point talk properly about elite Mongol forces for the historical unit types. And this entire force is sort of strategically complete when you realize that there were 16,000 other men guarding other sundry members of the imperial family. So if you sum this, like it's 25,000 plus other 4,000 of the various princes, so you reach essentially 30,000. This is essentially the force that would install itself eventually into China properly as the major, like the descendants of the Chingizid dynasty, and therefore also Sinicize in the process, but firmly aware of the originary power foundation of Mongol background. In fact, would remain in the local organization. You have this staff force that is grafted and maintained and upkept, like more or less along the traditional patterns from the Chinese resources, right? And in many ways it can be resupplied, refilled, restored from Mongolia herself, with all the game that in a sense had already been going on before the Mongols, also in a deeper historical time. There were the Jin already, the Yurkand, but had been doing with properly Mongolia proper. Now, the supply trains of the Mongols consisted, as you know, largely, we said it before, many pack animals. And there is all an environmental variety, depending on the various areas that the Mongols covered. For example, camels in some areas, this was already true at the time of the Islamic invasions in places like the Middle or East or Central Asia, were extremely reliable animals, also more than the pretty sturdy, ugly, and terribly resisting Mongol horses. You can argue that the men had been selected genetically in similar ways, and yeah, like humans developed mostly in the last, say, tens of millennia of their history, largely through a relentless selection, through warfare, incredible massacres, and more. As you know, the living conditions in Mongolia were terrifying than compared to anything like in the sanitary world. And in many ways, this was the real secret of the Mongol army's success, right? This was made clear also by the various spies slash diplomats slash sort of anthropologists that were sent from anthropologists, anti-literam, of course, from the Western courts, right, that literally came back saying that if our peasants ate the garbage that the Mongols Khans did, right, they would have been able to conquer the world, and that's exactly what the Mongols were doing, right? And this is perhaps the single best explanation of why the Mongols did what they did. I'm not joking, right? This is, in a strictly military historical sense, the most pertinent explanation that you can offer, like when looking at this, how they did it, not why, maybe, because that's yet another story we'll have to talk about. But it's really relevant. And as far as supply trains were concerned, again, it was mostly their own horses that provided. Also, they brought all the herds, so they brought milk, meat. Right, these men literally spent their life on horseback, and of course they would loot and pillage and massacre and and find whatever they could sustain themselves through. Some, again, marches of the Mongol army were massive feats in the history of mankind. These were done at the expense, of course, a lot of starvation losses as a consequence. Frequently, say, the Genghis Khan, I say the because of course the Oceanic ruler, simply Genghis Khan, would also keep a number of warrior-mounted camels, right, as a reserve to disrupt an enemy cavalry force, which was an old trick. The horses are really unnerved by the smell of the camels. So the idea is that at some specific moment of the battle you could throw the camels in and say camels were expensive by themselves, but they could in some critical moments be used as a very effective anti-cavalry force. Following the Mongol armies would be, of course, all this enormous amount of allies and conquered auxiliaries. In our last video, we have seen, as we were saying, all the peoples that the Mongols conquered and or attempted to conquer in any case, right? So mostly reduced around China to tributaries. We've seen how essentially the Chingizids crushed the Jin dynasty in the north of China and then passed on to take out the Songs that had in the south that had supported them prior against this Jin Yurkan, so that they were essentially northern China, but as a Mongol ruled state, whereas the Songs were Han Chinese, and they were in fact sort of more depositories of the broader tradition. When the Songs were taken out, there was a massive amount of manpower and labor force that the Mongols could extract from China. Actually, everything had to be organized and mastered and regulated ad hoc, right? But we've seen how, for example, during the Mongol invasion of Japan, there were massive amounts of Korean and Chinese infantrymen next to the Mongols. It was already, again, we haven't talked too much about this, but we'll cover it throughout the Chinese warfare series. A lot of course, Mongol influence in Chinese warfare and vice versa from quite a while. So we're not talking about, in terms of material culture, let's say at least in the essentials of what an armed man would be conceived like. We'll see it mostly in the next video on the unit types that differ so much from one another. And there would have been a mixed way, for example, of organizing the supplies, right? The Mongols would have provided with certain, say, material aspects that mostly came from the steppes and were, for example, better suited for harsher weather. Some campaigns in the north, maybe the Songs were not so habituated to that. Vice versa, there was a sort of greater material availability, sort of greater refinement and civilization in the south that would help the Mongols. The Songs had, for example, master the development of firearms in China up to this point. So the Mongols adopted this from the south. And so you have this enormous range of auxiliaries that at some point, this videos are just really an introduction, so I will get to the point which we will talk about this all in depth throughout Chinese history and more. But you really named them. You can imagine skirmishers, say, I don't know, mostly connected with the northern steppe. Still, some sort of broken nomadic people that the Mongols had conquered in the surroundings and now provided mostly as spent force, those horse archers, or artillery crewmen from the most specialized Chinese military engineers. The same goes for fortification builders, right? Anything that was especially useful for conducting siege warfare. We know that the Mongols brought these Chinese specialists as far as Europe, right? And they adapted pretty quickly, like their polyurcetic capacities to the Chinese standards. Sometimes it's difficult archaeologically to even distinguish Wuz Wu in certain contexts. For example, we've seen it as far as the Mongol invasion of the Rus was concerned. We find some giant ballistas. We don't understand where these were Ruthenian or Mongol, and in spite of the greater or smaller refinement, right, in particular siege technologies, like the essentials were pretty much the same also across Eurasia. So if anything was, as we'll see now, mostly about steppe people's adaptation to siege warfare, which had never quite been much their thing. The Mongols owe most of this learning from China, and so we're looking here at, in fact, heavily Sinified forces. Now, the main Mongol force of cavalry, like heavy plus larger amount of horse archers, were employed and organized to strict regulations, right? Their lifestyle was already militarized by native customs. There was class of recruitment. Basically, the first two ranks of the cavalry were meant to be armored in iron, if possible, including frontal horse armor. This seems very steppe-like, right? In the West, there were comparisons. There were, generally speaking, during the 13th century, ever greater sort of parts of horse armor, also full barding at some point towards the last decades appears, but it's very, very rare. Here it's somewhat similar, but there is also a greater tendency of the steppes like to have that minimal protection for the heavies in actually hard enough, at least armor, hopefully metal, that, however, you don't have to give for granted. Whereas, again, the Mongol military culture, material culture, was extremely primitive. Like, we tend to have this idea that the Mongols were conquering everything and everyone again because they had, technology were so dramatically, but no, right? They were an incredibly underdeveloped people, and they remained this throughout the entire thing. So unless you look at properly the Yuan or the Ilkhanate or wherever they settled, there were some, they could use some greater local wealth. It's a thing, like in this case for China, but the sense is that the essential of their warfare, their effectiveness, still stemmed from action, not from much what kind of technical devices they were using. In the steppes in general, however, lamellar armor especially was more spread, was more evident, also iconographically, than what we see, for example, in the West at some point. This doesn't mean too much because, in general, of course, the sanitary world was more heavily armored. This is true also for China compared to the Mongols, not just Europe. But the elite was sort of more elite, right? The idea is that there was a much greater divide in the steppes between the rulers and the ruled, right? The rulers would take basically everything from the ruled, and so they would constitute this very elite force, with, for example, armor that at its pinnacles was even more advanced than the one of the sedentary people, at least in the comparative elite, a tiny bit. But the rest, the majority of the forces, were all horse archers, and they were sort of spent. Naturally, it is true that throughout the quite varied history of the Mongol armies, there was a lot in between, right? There was a lot of what you would call, at least in terms of protection, medium, especially cavalry, right? If we stick mostly to the Mongol, native Mongol forces. But overall, right, there wasn't in fact that much of a structure that in a step could simply make the average Mongol, even at the peak of the empire, like an affluent enough horseman to have this particularly high level of protection. Also, armor was it was much less standardized than we think. Actually, these provisions that we're listing here now are exactly a proof of this. There was a greater need of reorganization, of order, of certainty regarding the quality, the homogeneity, the uniformity of these forces. And this naturally was more feasible in China. Like, it would start having these records as far as the Chingizid domination goes. And of course involving also, we'll see them now, the auxiliary forces, because they could have not essentially fought without these. And most of the latter followed the prior organization. Like, there was no essential change, like from a Mongol imposition of how these guys had to be armored. If anything, there could be a revival, reorganization, and in this case, some greater standards required, but not a major injection, say, of Mongol, let's say, arms and armor on the average Chinese levy, right? The remaining three ranks of the Mongol cavalry that, again, could be just here are idealized as the by this stratification, like what a fully supplied Mongol army should be, would have had to wear only hide armor, if any at all, as we were saying before. And even this 2-3 ratio was, of course, to be kept as closely as possible, because it was not normal for a steppe army to have just 2 out of 5 horsemen armored to that higher level, right? So everything would be much more sober in appearance, but this was at least the ambition of the Mongol rulers. And there would be an important digression to make regarding what kind of, in fact, even Chinese mentality the Yuan were expressing as far as what had to be provided, right? There was a lot of idealism. Very often these sources, not even the actual dispositive documents through which the troops were actually levied. They were just maybe just some idea of what like a Mongol army had to be. This is something we've seen also in India and in other countries, where you realize that everything was much less fancied and depicted in these sort of stylish documents. Nevertheless, there is also surely an influence that China has on the material culture of the rulers. It's, again, an immense territory. You can't say that really the Mongol conquest altered the balance of at least the ratios of military contribution as far as this equipment was, say, the general military effort was concerned, right? So more or less the Mongols installed themselves and kept asking more or less what had been asked by the previous rulers, whichever they had been. However, the Mongols had probably a bit more of a predatory mentality, especially at the beginning, for which they also needed to take control. Like, they needed in part also to demilitarize the locals to the extent that it would have gotten they would have spent more for themselves the resources, the potential that the local communities had. And so it is possible that, of course, the Mongol forces based in China were, of course, more materially wealthy than the ones of native Mongolia. There is no doubt. So maybe the 2-3 ratio is not really met. It's not really met much anywhere, unless in fact you stretch like what it means in the first 2 ranks out of 5 having, say, armor, which kind of like, actual metal, or because armor can be anything technically. We see, for example, some cavalry one, and that also is not really typical of the steppe in that proportion, right? So we can definitely think that the sedentary influence here is key. And it's just an ideal picture anyway. The Mongols had their type of mobile warfare to a level of regularity that transformed it almost in a pure science. At least their military organization was so well tested, oiled, and kept in full efficiency throughout all these expeditions they carried out for centuries, keeping together this enormous system that ultimately crumbled. But still, right, that you can appreciate like the fact their very level of militarization down the even the most humble of the Mongol ranks. They had very interesting strategic habits, by the way. Think about planning, again, like campaigns at several thousands of kilometers of distance. This would naturally be launched from closer bases, but especially as far as the north-south axis is concerned, but when moving also from the eastern and the western ends of the Eurasian steppes, things were and could be more complicated. And of course, the enemies weren't just sitting there, nor, as we've seen, the Mongols were undefeatable in the first place, but their methods gave them very often a decisive edge. For example, they used to send a reconnaissance force 300 kilometers or more ahead of the main army, right? Not just to reconnoitre, but also to spread the word that the Mongols were coming. So psycho-ops, of course, designed to terrorize the population, much, of course, what was eventually received by us. Think about the horde, right? The horde that stemmed from the exact idea of this Mongol armies has entered our vocabulary with an incredibly negative semantic, right? And this was very relevant and allowed the Mongols also not to bottle up some places where they couldn't simply sort of pull out safely, and just being aware what kind of threats they could face and what kind of preparations they could make. This was also particularly important for, if anything, steppe warfare had been, right? They had kept fighting against other Mongols. There were civil wars at this point, so it wasn't much about the sanities, whose defenses naturally had to be tested quite carefully, but the steppes foes that could really catch them off guard across this multi-thousand kilometers expeditions that really needed some very good understanding of what was happening in the surrounding from quite early on in the campaign. Many times this was enough to, by the way, cause the target to submit. For example, in the case of Cambodia, right, just as we've seen, the Khmer were sort of warlike, militarized people, simply backed down without even trying anything against the Mongols. Perhaps, maybe exactly because they had some sort of military understanding This at least spared them from bloodshed, which instead happened in other countries, such as the Dai Viet. This was naturally happening also because these peoples, specifically in Southeast Asia, were to become tributaries, right? The Mongols would have not really lorded over them directly. It was just say, okay, we submit, but leave us alone. We'll pay our due, and that's it. In any case, this still reflects the fear that the Mongols managed to instill in their opponents. A fear so great, in fact, that the consequences of resisting and losing appear so terrible to really allow such major, also regional accomplishments of the Mongol armies. The initial blows inflicted by the Mongols were dealt by the skirmishing light cavalry element that constituted the vanguard and wings as well to harass the enemy with bows and javelins. And the idea was to create a screen around the main body. This is a strategy that was employed by many steppes peoples, and actually it tells you how cautious they really were and how sort of aware of their potential vulnerability, especially against armies that could sort of smash harder, right? All this idea, for example, refusing the center, enveloping the enemy, etc. We're not the fruit of some more highly say sophisticated Oriental philosophy, etc. It literally stemmed from the fact that if they had stood there to wait for the attack, they would have been overwhelmed, right? And so they were, of course, that good to be able to perform the tactic well, but it was not the tactic per se. It was just how good such an experienced army would be. And of course, this depended on the commanders, on the morale, on the general situation. We know, of course, the Mongols for their major tactical and strategical achievements. The Mongols would attempt to lure an enemy over difficult terrain to encumber or destroy that force, but that also reflects, as we were saying, the fact that they counted on the actual overconfidence of an enemy and sort of retreating and together with retreating on such a more difficult terrain actually showed together how the Mongols themselves didn't simply go for it, because they really didn't have immediately that upper hand that sort of we mythologically attribute to them, and to a bit like with this sort of self-sabotaging attitude towards Oriental foes. That's not really how military history speaks, really. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. And it's not to say that the Mongol forces were not, really that threatening. The odds would have been balanced, where they could have also gone just on the attack. But they had evidently the capacity to do otherwise when they thought that it was better to lure the enemy to a sort of trap or to soften him up, to harassing him with horse archers. Would never know where the main force really was. Those tactics, as well as were very psychologically effective, because you never know when the enemy, with the big one, may come. Right? It's the incredibly enervating experience just to be constantly under this horse archer's fire. It's full of dust. You can't really see around. You never know whether the bulk of the enemy forces is just a few kilometers away, or maybe it's hundreds of kilometers away. And so that's how the Mongols play as well, enemy psychology. Strategically and tactically, the Tulugma was favored. The Tulugma was the Mongol standard sweep, in which the enemy's flanks were turned inward and attacked simultaneously from front and rear. Right? The sense was to, again, essentially lure him so much into this trap to simply envelope him and get it over with. It was risky because you could never say how resilient this enemy would have been, or whether your own forces could have simply managed to carry out the entire thing. But they counted on a great enough say, as we've seen, wearing out capacity summed up with, say, an attack from all sides, also en masse, right? Especially about the wings, the lighter elements, there hadn't to be anything very scientific. There were really scattered mass attacks. The most important, of course, element was the center, like the bulk, and that had to essentially pin the enemy down and resist until all forces could converge on him, right? And this was risky, right? But at that point, you could also annihilate him brutally. In battle array, the Mongols set even a sort of buffer zone, which was destined to, in part, lure the enemy, as we said, and so composed of essentially expendable forces, prisoners of war and or allies, auxiliaries in the front. This was also the price you had to pay as a Mongol subject. You could be simply levied to eventually be put in front of an enemy just to be massacred while the Mongols were just maneuvering around, thinking in the bigger picture. And that's not very nice, but that's objectively what traditionally the defeated has to pay for being still alive, at least not having fought to the death in the first place. And this is intense because, as we just said, it's not just like the Mongols conquered sedentary peoples and this particular type of armies. Sometimes these auxiliaries were brought in the very steppes. This is not happening too often, but it depends on which peoples we're talking about. Maybe the average Chinese militiaman would have not been brought to the steppe in the first place, also because militia was kind of sucked at the organization, so that it was better for those guys to work in the field and to provide the Mongols with greater surplus for their own equipment and logistics, etc. But of course, there were instances in which, of course, also during the civil wars within the same China or elsewhere, there were also steppe infantrymen that were used like that. Those would have been a bit better used to resist horse archery, etc. But we're talking still about relatively cheap troops that weren't really making too much. As we'll see now, the Mongols had their own infantry, and also good one to an extent, at least as far as the steppes could provide. The idea was for these troops to absorb, to bear the brunt of the enemy missiles, and also their own equivalents as harassing troops, right, or other auxiliaries. And of course, there were all kind of combinations of how these troops could be deployed. Again, this video cannot be that complete. For that, we have to see in depth from the sources. Battling the battles we'll be talking about later are not really meant to show this, and takes time. Just let's start first of all. And we also know too few, telling the truth. It's not like the Chinese documentation is so rich to tell us exactly, right, how these battles unfolded, down to the details. We hardly know it for Western Europe. You can imagine for these places, by the way. And that's not to say that China was not advanced, but it was also societally very different from Europe, and so there wouldn't be sort of free, random middle-class chroniclers that were politically and military active that would tell you their experience of how that battle had. No, right? This is a heavily crystallized and hierarchical system in which there is only a very narrow and a very elite court and sort of bureaucracy working for the emperors, and then the overwhelming rest of China working in the fields. Yes, there were merchants, there were artisans, there was a level of urbanism. There's not to say that it was only that, but the level of almost feudal control that existed even within the state, right, this heavily developed state, is incarnated a bit by the same Mongols and their ways, right? Surely, again, we don't have the average Mongol telling us exactly what he was up to normally in one of these engagements, unfortunately. It would have not made any sense to them. It would have been seen as a form of weakness and unmanliness to even think to write or to do such things. directly following these expendable troops were the Mangudai. These were veritable suicide troops that were meant to, as this happened also in the West in other contexts, like to literally break through, like as the spearhead of the formation. There was, as a matter of fact, elite veterans and or like very, say, elite youths that had to prove their valor. It was a mean of selection, if you want, also for the next military elite, for the commanders, rulers, that had to literally charge the enemy and attempt to goad them into hasty pursuit or literally breaking through them, depending on, again, which kind of enemy this really was. It was really difficult to perform this maneuver. You will always lose someone in the process, but it also showed what kind of, for example, like kind of equestrian you were, and also what kind of nerves and cold blood you could maintain in this situation where it's not much about the individual you, but how the general collective training of the unit performs. So these are incredible people that, however, do find their parallels also like in the rest of the medieval world. This tactic, of course, was not original. In fact, it was evidently used to effect just to remain in the area by the Xiongnu back in the migration era. And again, we will be talking about this stuff also soon, perhaps in our medieval European armies. Right? We have the Doppelsöldner in the Renaissance. We have the Feditori in the Italian communes. We have like people performing those roles mandatorily. Think about those who also literally clad themselves as kings to get themselves killed and fooling the enemy in battle. We have them, right? Many, like think about the Angevins at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, right? It's feats of unrestrained heroism that pertain really to an elite, right? To people that had a lot to lose, right? So it was not, were not again the throwaway stinky peasants thrown just to buy time. These were the guys who had to either break or lose, right? Depending on like also breaking through sometimes, not just pulling out, but it was part of the game. Now, behind these Mangudai troops followed the main body of the Mongols, right? And so this is what we're talking about when we think about the refused center, right? The main body was stationed in fact, at the bottom of the formation. There might have been rear guards, but fundamentally this was the main body had to perform like the decisive maneuver during the battle. This was supported by wings, right, that were composed by a multitude of trustworthy auxiliary cavalry. They didn't have to do anything, let's say, too excessively complex. Like the wings had to open and eventually to fall back on the enemy once again, or keep in to harass them, right, as mostly horse archers. But this main body was formed in 5 ranks. It's the ones that we ideally described before, the ones with 2 armor, 2 not, that had evidently like a heavy cavalry function. Even in the lighter element, it was still a melee cavalry. And these had essentially to meet, as we were saying before, with the main body of the enemy and resist until like it was surrounded and would collapse. I don't know, you see this at the Battle of Legnica. There are many familiar sort of, like this was not just a Mongol tactic. The Turks used this tactic, the Magyars used this tactic, so we will see it again, right? Some even more familiar. The Byzantines, to some extent, also tried to perform something similar. In the rear of all these lines, there were the prized Chinese artillerists that somewhere they must have been left. Like the camp was not really a very safe place because it was routinely attacked by enemy forces. So it was better to have these men out in open field, guarded by the same Mongol officers, so like sort of the command itself. One reason is that there was some field artillery. There was, think about rockets. They were actually used in open field, and again, this is not really an age in which, say, artillery has such a meaningful impact in open field. But again, these troops were so important that they had to be guarded no matter what. So they had to be stationed in the array of the Mongol army, tactically effective or not, just because you couldn't do without them. These armies were heading towards cities that had to be bombarded and stormed, and so these specialists were quite much needed. There were a few, by the way. Like, it would have not been, like, the crewmen could be trained adequately, and so it was not an enormous amount of troops, but they were also very skilled, and that could not be easily replaced. Now, when the preliminary harassing actions were completed, and the Mongols themselves about to be committed, what stands out is the ferocity, like the fear, again, that this army is able to transmit, but also the beauty, the harmony. The idea was that every Mongol horseman knew at all times what he had to do. In this immense arrays, by the way, that you, like, when you actually look at the numbers and try to, for example, reconstruct the size of the formation, you realize that with tens of thousands of horsemen, like, the spaces must have been immense. There were drums, there were different means of signaling, flags, etc. And the idea is that impressed also very much the external observers was how orderly these units moved, and how silently, how much they could essentially all hear, like, the signals at a great distance through this massive drums, as we were saying before, and how they could understand the minimal variations for moving accordingly and performing this very difficultly collective maneuvers to perfection. Of course, this was also ideal. Battles could and would become in a pretty sorry mess all the time, but of course, maintaining that level of cohesion, coordination, and chain of command was as long as possible during the fray, and all these complex maneuvers, the chaos of the fight, like, was a very important way to get closer to victory. Upon the direction of the Mongol general, the army would advance at jog-trot in utter silence, as we were saying. There's not really, like, the armies do not really run, right? They don't charge for a kilometer, like they do so for a very short amount of space and time. But of course, there are different distances to cover. There are different. Just think about how, I don't know, curving, wheeling maneuvers work. Like, they really require an internal order of the formation to properly function. But again, the Mongols were probably also that silent just by lifestyle, just knew how the thing worked, and they were so habituated to this all that their ethnic native component just lived for that. So it wasn't even necessary to really train them. It was just enough since you were a kid to go on over these campaigns and these expeditions and learn. Initially, the signals were given just by moving standards. However, there was that precise moment in which the great Nakara was sounded. This was, I made a video explaining also in the Islamic military music, but the Nakara Kana responded to that the steppe peoples were very much obsessed with, especially percussion instruments, because they were sort of more useful for the drilling rhythm, in fact, of these large swarms of light cavalry. There were other instruments. But it was important that no sound be uttered before the great nakara, so that the emphasis was on the great drum's pounding beat. It was just like a great heartbeat of this enormous being that the army was, in which every element corresponded just to the sheer will of the oceanic ruler, right? And like that literally permeated imperially all this system. And so at that moment, the charge was sounded along the line, and every Mongol let out with his most diabolical shrieks and screams. That was scary as hell. There were all, again, like means like there were hissing arrows, were the heavenly bells tied to the horses, caparisons. There was all a sense that the fury, the wrath of God, right, was unleashing in one blow, right? And it would take naturally quite a bit of discipline to hold troops of this sort of background, but the idea is that this was the moment of the lesser elements, this majority of especially subjugated peoples that literally could not afford any better equipment than bow and quiver, that had been traumatically brutalized in their very existence, because again, being taken over by the Mongols was not just an experience that wouldn't leave trace for centuries, deeply ingrained in the, if not millennia, by the way. There is an impact that some countries in the world had after the Mongol conquest that have not gone away. Remember this, and that now, however, had their chance of sort of redemption. Right, the idea, of course, was an evangelical sort of again racial elevation of whoever belonged to this great host that would manage to conquer the world. And so here, like that individuality could be let loose. It was needed because great ruler and his heavenly standards could have not been such if he could have not fully controlled in the most violently and viciously brutal way these peoples under his heel, but alive and carrying that force that was training essentially that domineering muscle of the ruler. And so this was also like a terrible show off of those demonic lower forces that and these lower elements of the Mongol armies too well incarnated. And again, it's very difficult even to speak of the level of violence, of pure evil that actually, this is what these lesser elements were born to be, right, by destiny. That's what their actual status was for such behavior to be to happen. Like if you were taken down with one of these, it's because you were no better, and so you deserve to disappear into nothingness, right? Whereas a tougher sort of men-at-arms was meant at least to slaughter lots of them had they ever closed in, and he had still to contend against their arrows, by the way. So it was all like a terrible divine punishment for anyone who would face them. At the same time, again, I always say it, to this extent we also overrate dramatically Mongol military capacities. Again, there is a lot in their emergence from the steppes that of course takes on a universal meaning, history of mankind, but it's not like this thing also had much of a longer history, or some greater stepping further, right? Other countries went on, this here, China, Persia, etc. Like, and Mongolia remained where it was, where it kept remaining insidious to a degree, but say the history of the world went on even after, of course, the Mongol Empire was no more. Doesn't matter, it had been heavily impacted by it, as we were saying. Still, this system at the end of the day faded. Nevertheless, even when showing that sort of more negative side, while feigning rout, for example, admitting that any rout was actually ever feigned, like in military history, in an intentional sense. Again, if the idea is that yes, you're trained for that, as we've seen for the suicide squads as well, but the sense is that if you can't break through, you would, right? So if you are feigning flight, it's because still you have not something better to do. And still, when withdrawing, just like the Scythians centuries before, of course, the Mongols would shoot right from, let's say, their bows behind them, just like a Parthian shot, right? And this tactic seldom had to be employed against their enemies, because the majority, at least, of enemies that they would confront were not going to chase the Mongols, right? There is, however, to point out that the aforementioned Tulugma suicide, again, feigning rout, seldom failed, right? It was something so well, again, experimented in these armies that they knew exactly how to perform it, and exactly perhaps because it was not so frequent for such a tactic to be needed, that also the enemies were a bit more off guard regarding that. Surely there are, again, great examples. The European ones are sort of the more notorious, but it happened in many other instances. So speaking about training, as we said, there was a lot of emphasis on discipline and training. The same Temujin had learned this greater order brought by in a civilizational context from the Khitans, right? That were a bit more organized and advanced than Temujin Mongols at the time. So there is a philosophy that naturally the Mongols come to be acquainted with in the millenary Chinese tradition of warfare. That is also overwhelmingly overrated. I mean, nothing of the military theories that existed at this point had anything to do with the positive application of the same in a practical sense. In a say, do this and you will actually win. This is the greatest BS in the history of mankind, as I explained extensively in the Von Kriege series, also in the videos about actual treatises. I have something coming on soon about this yet again. It's not until the 17th century, and probably even von Clausewitz in the 19th, that you actually have an art of war that is explained in a way that can, at best, however, function as an integration to military experience, and that tends to consider absolute principles in a way you eventually have to decline them in reality, right? Never think that if you read, I don't know, Sun Tzu, you're actually looking at, pearls of molten gold of any system of the art of war, the theory of the art of war. There's just a bunch of anecdotes written in very specific contexts, like stratified throughout the centuries and just being a divertissement. The guy says, never besiege a city, literally, right? How can that be even part of a systemic theory, or the system of the time of Pythagoras? You don't get what that is meant for, as much as you don't get how much practice, about which also we know too few, unfortunately, was enough at the time, through, I'd say, the normal experience gathered by this aristocratic rulers at war to, in fact, lead armies. And again, I will not digress because we have still a lot to say, but it's sort of obvious and sort of embarrassing how actual adults still believe. Otherwise, I really have to do other videos about this. But as we were saying before, in fact, and this is to the point, Mongol armies didn't really need much of a training, right? Already these peoples were sort of very warlike and militarized by the constant violence that occurred among them. But it was probably, in fact, in this context, also when the same Chingizid stepped further, etc., like the need to simply retrain their forces. They say a campaign, a lifetime spent at war was enough by grades to acquire that capacity, right? By the way, when the Mongols were involved in warfare, they practiced and honed their talents for it. There was, as we were saying before, also a completely different worldview than most peoples, especially the sanitary ones. These people lived in a level of incredibly and unspeakably traumatic and violent and as systemic, relentless, existential, and univocal abuse psychophysically. They were habituated to kill people, to do terrible things, and say it was just that normal to be brutalized as a normal existence since you were a child, that, war objectively didn't seem like anything particularly violent, even when, massacring entire cities, making massive piles of skulls out of, the massacre of women and children. To them, it was completely normal. It was just living a normal life. They didn't really have, they thought it was normal. Again, if these people had been so weak to be killed, it was their fault, or somebody else should have protected them. This is how they got more from their miserable life in terms of surplus, and that's how they went on until it worked. There's really not much to understand. And again, it wasn't particularly the best system. In fact, that ended, and civilization had been there already for a reason, to be way more resilient than this at a greater level. But again, these are the Mongols, right? There is no other way. Think about how psychologically this affects even things like discipline, right? Maintaining order, when you can't simply, break the teeth of someone who just dares to think that he may not. It's absolutely working at levels that you have no idea. Skinning people alive, quartering them, burning them, torturing many other ways. It was, again, completely normal. People would obey, and if you didn't, you died, and so the best would remain, and that's how it worked, right? It's that simple, and it's that effective at this level of organization. There was, of course, this acquaintance, as we were saying before, with, in fact, more civilized ways of war, and so, of course, there is all a level of, for example, of Chinese statehood that has to be learned just to have much greater means than the Mongols had before. They must sort of understand how to, reason by that scale of government, and that changes their mind. That happens immediately. We've seen it also in the Ilkhanate. There is an obvious integration immediately of the subjects in the army that are co-opted, they are to contribute, and so really there is a very different mindset kicking in before the Mongols, also for actually very practical, lucid reason that you can't really go against, really, in a political, strategical sense, would again wipe out Baghdad, Merv, raise everything to the ground. To us, it's barbarity, but it kind of made sense if you understand what sort of the current situation in that campaign really was, what kind of moral effect, also in the prospect of ruling these people, this was supposed to do. And that's in fact what really happened later. The Mongols sort of civilized, were absorbed by subjects, and the system went on. This had been happening in many ways with so many dominations since a very long time. Every Harban was held to account for actions of any member within it. Equal punishment was dealt to every member of the Arban, should any member warrant it. This is just like in the Roman army, right? One guy from one unit fucked up for some reason, you pick one guy out of it, and you make the others that are technically his brothers, in broader context, clubbing him to death. smashing his organs, breaking his bones in front of everyone. And that's how you sort of redeem. This is very useful, because if somebody does not work in the unit and causes the mess for which everybody is responsible, the guy must be taken out, right? And so you teach people how to make this thing work. Again, I will have to touch this topic as far as the contemporary military is concerned, because things changed in history, but there are some things that sort of remained in similar ways. Normally, like, again, this is cool in the sense that if you look at how civilization was working at the time, it sort of fits. But today it's not that it doesn't work, but it's, let's say, in this way at least, it does not work to the extent you would like, right? And there are other ways you have, first of all, to pay for the loss of that. In part, you have to accept that there's actually a much greater mental fragility among people than there was at the time. This is something I've been convincing myself of over decades of studying military history, listening to veteran interviews from different generations, and looking, in fact, also at these other peoples and how they lived throughout history. And there is really a lot that we should point out. In any case, this practical experience, also through just training, not just necessarily warfare, because training in many ways was, just as for the Romans, basically the same kind of level of violence, was gathered from years of conquest. Think about the armies of Chingizid-Khan. And so this would make, to some extent, each Mongol cavalryman a veteran member of this, in this sense, a very elite corps. Right? So the Mongol army initially was that hell of a thing, of a steamroller for this reason, experience. As we said before, these peoples are radically underdeveloped, but I can't stress how, right? This is not like a personal opinion. This is literally what the Mongols were. They were savages living in the wilderness, right? That's what they actually and only were. Today we talk about Yuan China, so this is, again, something else. But what makes the effective is, in fact, it's not technology, it's not whatever. It's the fact that these people fought for a living their entire life. There's just a completely different, again, psychological background that makes them do this, whereas other peoples wouldn't. This is the major edge, right? So as far as that is concerned, there is a moral dimension that the Mongols sort of champion in this context. And of course, there were some Mongol armies that sucked as well. I mean, not every savage from the steppe, doesn't matter how habituated to cut throats, rape, and burn children, is able to perform military. Thank God. And in fact, that's where the sense of hierarchy, of superiority of the Oceanic ruler comes from. Again, you will cause like a genocide if these people don't comply. And this is as effective as simple to motivate them, right? Think about the deterrence of that. Think about the moral effect that just on the neighbors of seeing like entire peoples wiped out. This happened throughout entire history, where peoples, for example, were completely sort of irrelevant in the bigger picture, but just slaughtering them was effective for a polity to say, don't mess with us. We've seen it with the Romans. They were actually some of the most generously redemptive peoples in the history of mankind. The Mongols are perhaps the best example of such, cynical brutality that, however, did correspond very concretely to a political and strategical vision. This, from the elites, was really calculated in those terms. Like, it's not that they weren't incapable of passion or whatever, but the general circumstances when studied actually show you an enormous consistency with these decisions. So the Mongol army would be a mix of many different forces. Essentially, the Mongols could have armored, unarmored cavalry or infantry. The same goes for the auxiliaries, the Chinese artillerists. There's no way to simply make like a complete list of, let's say, how, like, I made a video already in that sense of the actual strength of the Mongol armies. More or less, they really fought just with their own native forces as Mongols. Then again, they sort of adapted throughout the centuries to local warfare, but still maintaining throughout these generations, of course, the primacy of their nomadic warfare, military tradition. And we will see this in sort of other battles. Today we pass actually to part of the latter, in a Chinese context, and or like in the surroundings, that is not so well documented as in the battles against the Europeans, but they are sort of telling. The first is the siege of Xingqing. Never forget, we're in the Middle Ages, also in East Asia, and so that siege warfare is really very important. When we talk about Chinese warfare, there is a lot of that, and we're in 1209, and the Mongols are fighting against the Chinese state of the Xingxia. In the west of the country, there's a lot of sort of their steppe influence as well. And here we are in the adolescence, you can say, of the Mongol army, as far, especially as Poliorcetics is concerned. Like, the Mongols have yet to fully get acquainted with the nuances of protracted sieges and all the efforts that this entail for people that is habituated to fight against men, not wolves, at large, and that have to learn all the technicality that, or at least to refine it, to develop further just as a military machine. And this episode is interesting because the Mongols were aware of the fact that in order to subject Xingqing, it was the enemy capital, they would have in fact to bring in the new siege warfare techniques that were at that point more proper of the enemy and in fact of the Chinese context than else. And you can actually take cities not just by storm, but in other ways. In fact, the Mongols set out to divert the course of the Yangtze River to the city to flood it, right? Sometimes, like, these things happen in other contexts, but mostly it was about stripping cities from the access to water. The Mongols would do it in other occasions. And in fact, even in this one, the Mongol effort did not succeed, right? In fact, the Mongols constructed and dug a very competent canal, admittedly, but they wouldn't allow for the direction of the flow of the river. And so when the barriers were broken and the water rushed through, it was the Mongol camp to get flooded instead, of course, with great distress and sort of, some had jumped after that. And so the Mongols weren't, however, to back down, were not really the types. And so they understood that they could fix this quite quickly. And in any case, the city garrison surrendered anyway. And so, that was not even the problem to begin with, right? There are, in fact, some strategic essentials that really never change. You can sort of find ways to kill the time during siege warfare, but sometimes, there were actually, as you understand here, very strong efforts, but there is also politics, just if you wonder why I have the von Clausewitz avatar in the first place. Then in 1234 we have an interesting event, that is the fall of Kaifeng. That was the Chinese, the capital of the Jin dynasty of the Yurchen, so these Mongols that had been ruling northern China, to which the Songs had contributed together with the Mongols. However, the Song dynasty in southern China at this point sort of thinks that they can sort of beat the Mongols, and they act apparently in an insane way attacking the same Mongols in the north. They attacked and took the very cities of Kaifeng and Luoyang, so reasserting the sense of greatness. Consider that the same Jin had been usurping Song territory while they were moving out of the north as the first wave of Chingizid attacks had come. The Mongols were just, of course, set with their minds to take over all of China, so they basically responded as swiftly as decisively. In fact, Kaifeng and Luoyang immediately came back into their hands. 3 armies marched on the Song. This was also a thing. If you look at these massive armies, consider that there were often, in fact, multiple armies heading on different, on the same objective, getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen, on the same objective, but through different routes, which sort of makes sense also logistically speaking, because they were quite heavy, especially all those horses. Think about that. Not just the 30,000, but sometimes like 3 or 5 or 10 even as much. And so you can imagine the strains. This allowed the Mongols to, as we've seen, sustain themselves more easily just through the horses being more self-reliant, but they also had to lay waste the entire countryside, and they had to move fast, sort of Napoleonic armies ante litteram, because really the logistical demands are insane. Like a horse eats an indescribably excessive amount and also drinks, like you can't but always advance along major drinkable water sources, because otherwise, even if you are in the sort of more humid place ever, you will die, your army will disintegrate. So you have the first Mongol army that is commanded by Godan that takes Zhengtu in 1236. The one in the rear, commanded by Kuchu and Temutai, occupy Xiangyang and Kumbuga and Chagan Wanchkol. Here I'm pronouncing, like, from different sources, actually some different transliterations of Chinese centers, so some will be even unrecognizable. And in 1239, basically the Songs are reduced to obedience. The Mongols seize the entirety of China. In 1268, you have the Battle of Karakoram. Here we have Kaidu, who was, as we know, a nephew of Kublai Khan, essentially rebelling to his uncle's rule and actually bringing to decades of warfare that would, in fact, continue under Kublai Khan's successor, etc. And that can be seen as the moment in which the unity of the Mongol Empire ceased. Kaidu was essentially fighting from a Central Asian regional base power. That's also why here the battle is the Karakoram. And however, as other groups of Mongols that had been expelled from China before, such as the Western Khitai, and I made a video about their warfare a century before, were trying to re-enter China, right, and regain what was there. Here it was all a Chingizid legacy, and so it was a much bigger thing. But this also gives you an idea of the scale of Mongol strategy, right? How large of a space they would be able to cover just to recover China in this case. Something that they wouldn't do for the West, for example, which also tells a lot. Of course, China was sort of the overtly dominant power, also in a unitary sense at this point in Eastern Eurasia. So in this battle, you find Kublai Khan's force equaling one of his nephew. The two armies met at the plain of Karakoram, and there is we don't know too much, like also given the context, but we know that it was preliminary skirmishing, and then the main forces clashed, and the battle went on for most of the day, which sort of gives you an idea of how, of course, fiercely fought this battles really were. The battle, however, ended indecisively, also for this reason, because they were both very motivated and top-notch forces, the best of the Mongols, and the issue would not be settled for, again, a very long time, the early 14th century, and at that point you have the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia that remains on its own. China basically fails to take it back, and there is the mid-14th century crisis. The Pax Mongolica is over, like the open ways between Europe and China are broken by this political fragmentation, and much fades, but these chunks remain, like also China, the Yuan, have now sort of established their political territorial control. Then we have, and we described this in the video about medieval Burmese warfare, the 1272 Battle of Vochan. Here we have Kublai Khan having sent messengers to the Burmese because the Mongols expected subjection and tributes. We've seen how the Cambodians would do that, for example. But the Burmese refused, and so the Mongols set for their invasion. The Burmese ruler Narathi Pathe put together all the forces available to resist the Mongols. It's been estimated that from hundreds to thousands of war elephants were deployed. Marco Polo, who was apparently there, says that there were 2,000. Modern estimates say maybe a bit too few. Elephants also have, we've seen it in the videos about Indian warfare for that matter, were incredibly straining logistically speaking. But hey, in this area, like, there were lots of them, so you may never know. This was a full effort. The same Italian source tells about the elephants and their crews. There were apparently as many as 12, 16. Have some depiction of them in the video about Burmese warfare. For the rest of the Burmese army consisted of apparently 10,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry. Now, likely, again, these numbers have to be reduced. Likely this force was not larger than 30, 40,000. But you see here, like, the scale is there, and it's it's likely that also the proportion of cavalry to infantry, 1:5, is sort of spot on. The battle takes place in the plain of Vochan, right? And there is the Neskradin. There was a Persian commander in the Mongol army with only 12,000, however, well-trained veterans. This Mongol force was, essentially laid into battle array, orderly, calmly, and prompting the Burmese to move. As, of course, these were much more logistically strained, and they wanted to come to grips with the enemy as quickly as possible to avoid, like, the same army to collapse, basically, because of the enormous amount of supplies that was being paid, by the way, by the same country that was already invaded, so it was like a very difficult situation. Now, off to one side of the Mongol army, there was a huge forest that protected the Mongol right flank. And this order is given to the Burmese elephant riders to assume battle order and mount their beasts, which is realistic because just as for cavalry, like, it doesn't make sense just to mount this animal just with all your armor on and exhausted him waiting for the battle. And so if, as Marco Polo says, there were from 12 to 16 men on a single elephant. Like that was training also for these giants. So the Burmese advance at the order of their king. Neskhredin understands that the Mongol horses are scared by the war elephants. And so this is also, yes, we've seen camels, elephants do that make effect on horses. So Neskhredin is wise, and he orders the same Mongol cavalry to dismount. Consider here, like as we said, the Mongols have a covered flank. They are fighting against an army that is definitely like a sedentary one, like they're infantry essentially, plus this sort of slowly moving punching force. So there is something that must be orchestrated. In order to avoid disorder, the Mongol horses are tied to the trees of the forest nearby. By the way, I already told the story in medieval Burmese warfare episode, just repeating it, an emphasis perhaps on this Chinese-Mongol force. And so what do? You have elephants approaching, you have lots of archers. You start using these this potential against the pachyderms. And in fact, the Mongols do not waste their arrows against the Burmese crews on the elephants, but on the mounts themselves that are really hit by so much by the Mongols to be wounded and killed. Elephants very thick-skinned, which works almost as armor, but the Mongols were capable of delivering a devastating hail of arrows. It's been calculated considering how many arrows were contained in the quivers, that like an average Mongol army could shoot as many as 1,600,000 arrows in a single battle. Of course, this would have rather been like how many arrows would have been carried with the army. But in this major showdown, that is also the scale of the actual projectiles thrown. This is not so strange. Also, like in the West, you would be surprised normally how many missiles were really shot just by crossbowmen, etc., even with relatively contained numbers. And so the elephants are just hit by so many of these arrows that even though the damage of the single projectile was negligible, altogether it would start seriously damaging them. And Marco Polo says essentially that the elephants go crazy. They essentially escape away from the field. Marco Polo was apparently shocked by the uproar of the routing elephants, even though he was from the Mongol side, and if he really was there, there's a lot of controversy about this, but let's say he was, because after all, who are we just not to accept this and as a reliable source? So much that, in fact, Marco Polo speaks of the apocalypse in relation to these animals that are in pain and escaping in terror. So much so that they actually plunge into the forest and they tear and rip apart the crews. That fall into the ground. They get smashed, crushed by the same elephants along the way. This is really terrifying, sort of funny even, because of the dangers that normally elephants pose, even for their users in warfare. Right. So once the elephants had routed, essentially the Burmese had just infantry, and the Mongols feel confident enough. They don't have just infantry, but that the elephants were what they counted the most on in terms of smashing force, and the Mongols at that point instead are the equestrian masters, and they charge the Burmese. The battle was not immediately won, right? It's only at noon that the Burmese essentially turned and fled, and the Mongols chased them further, managing to capture, by the way, 200 of the elephants, which they would have used in their warfare, as we will see now. In fact, this is the point at which Kublai Khan started keeping properly some elephants of his own in the army. And it's quite fascinating. The same great standard of Kublai Khan was even mounted on a platform between 4 elephants. You know that the Mongols had this sort of mobile course on wagons, traditionally pulled by oxen. And the elephants are sort of more spectacular to some degree. These are brought elsewhere. We've seen how relevant this is. Also, Frederick II, for example, had an elephant a few decades before, and so that's always a hell of a show-off. And considering, by the way, that these Southeast Asian tributaries, because Burma is crushed at this point, will provide with war elephants, as they had many. This is something that was going on from Southeast Asia from quite a while, historically, to Western powers. Think about Pyrrhus Indian elephants with Indian mahouts, right, in southern Italy, in Sicily. Think about the Seleucids that received. I made a bit about the Mauryan elephants, in fact, on that occasion, and more. Because they had lots of them, just lots of them. Finally, we talk about the 1286 Battle of the Liao River, right? This is a clash still in the wake of Kaido's rebellion. We have Nayan of the Nayan Tartars, that is actually the cousin of the same Kublai Khan of China, that joins forces with Kaido, right, and began to challenge together the Chinese of the Mongols. It is said by the sources, but this is of course an exaggeration, that as many as 400,000 Nayan Mongols / Tatars, were Turks, obviously, coming from the Central Asian realities of, that I made a video about the Lipka Tatars. I explained that a little bit, but you know the story as well. Like, also the Golden Horde was ruled by Mongols, but factually were Turkic subjects. Kublai Khan's army counted equally, in an exaggerated way, 360,000 Mongol cavalrymen and 100,000 Chinese and allied infantry. Again, about these sources, not much the precise numbers, of course, that are ridiculous, but the proportion, in this case, between the Mongol ethnic troops and the Chinese ones. Consider that they were fighting in, like saying China. And you have this relation of almost 4-1. Right? So you understand that actually the Mongol forces were sort of way more important, also because most Chinese and allies, as we've seen, would have been infantrymen. And so just there's something more important about having a horseman, even if a horse archer in your ranks, especially when you consider that these Chinese and other allies are levy troops, like militias, are not this huge mush altogether. Of course, some troops are very fine, but they're elite, numerically speaking. The Chinese were commanded by Li Ting, by the way, the Mongols, because they here, it's not just like the rulers actually go. They have to control a lot of other things. The Mongols send, here we're talking about the Kublai Khan's army, right? So you have Li Ting, Chinese commander, Chinese troops in the army. Then Yuza Timur, the Mongolian commander. Plus you have some Kipchak contingents by Tutuka, because other chunks, like as the Golden Horde, as we were saying before, were actually contributing to this, and it was an old sort of Mongol civil war, while these other subject peoples participate. Kublai is actually there, forgotten this aspect actually, but it's important because he manages to fall on Kaido's flank. And this was a typical case of sort of strategic surprise that we were talking about before, rather than a tactical one. And this poses, of course, like the Chagatai Khanate in a sort of difficult spot, its forces rather, of course, and you have preliminary skirmishing as well. The Chinese use their technological superiority, catapults with fire projectiles, rockets as well, and the more backwards Central Asians suffer more. They are confused and disorganized in front of this onslaught. Kublai then advanced with the Mongol cavalrymen, and he has also some infantry pikemen following. The rear was taken up by bowmen and Chinese crossbowmen. So basically you have, at least ideally, we don't understand fully how real this development really is, but yes, there was some sort of infantry subordination to cavalry, of course, and just by proportions, but also in China, like cavalry was sort of superior to infantry at this point. And this infantry is backed by crossbowmen in the rear, so it's somewhat typical. I suspect that things may have been a little more complicated, especially considering the size of the forces involved. I mean, what spaces were there like for infantry to be effective while Mongol cavalry was operating? It's not really clear, right? About the ranges of the missile, how that worked. Did that work if the Mongols were just ahead with their horse archers? These are not questions to be answered, sadly, at least in this video. In any case, we know this was a massive, epic battle, and was a lot of confusion as well. Seemingly, the use of fire finished, or at least seemed like in perspective to really finish the Central Asians, that at this point were really crushed, right? And so this initial, at least, rebellion, and there would be other wars triggered by that, but it was quelled through this clash, and Kublai Khan retained complete rule at this point of the entire, what was still the entire Mongol Empire. And again, this war, as I was saying before, will continue to break that unity, but that's a really another story. So these battles, as simple as you see, understand there is nothing too certain about them, so surely at some point we will get into the details of some real sort of Chinese battle tactical analysis. This is not the case. It was just to show essentially what we're talking about, more or less the type of troops. At least we'll see better the latter in the next episode. But let's say what kind of context we're discussing, what kind of forces you're expected to find, and let's say what kind of organization, drill, armament, and mentality was there behind some of the most effective militaries in the history of mankind, right? So this is really what matters in perspective. That's why we make these videos in the first place. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.